Welcome back. My name is Karen Cooney. I'm the director of the Vera List Center for Politics, and the center is the host of this two-day conference on modality and locality. Major political challenges of our age, such as ecological catastrophe, racial injustice, technological acceleration, and violent economic exclusion, are deeply sedimented historical formations whose wakes and political transformation and its transgenerational nature alter our understanding of agency, radical labor, and struggle itself. Is the tension between the immediacy of fugitive forces of radical action and the slow, cumulative, invisible work of enduring a sign of spectral infrastructure? In this section, we're going to look towards forging the relationship between moments and processes of struggles over protracted temporalities and aesthetic forms. I'm very pleased that Maria Hlajová, the General and Artistic Director of BAC, will moderate this conversation between Adrian Heathfield, a professor of performance and visual culture at the University of Roehampton in London, and Nora Sternfeld, a professor of art education at the University of the Fine Arts in Hamburg. Let me just mention that their extensive biographies, still abbreviated, are pasted in the chat, and I encourage you to use the chat throughout the conversation to add comments, questions, and any reflections you care to share. And with that, Maria, please take it from here. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so very much. Welcome, everybody. Really happy to return to the notion of spectral infrastructure, this time from another angle, and I will offer floor to Adrian and Nora first before we engage in a conversation. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Maria. So we're going to actually do some separate presentations, so a little bit of. And as I think, as Mao mentioned, as a loose collective of thinkers and makers working over a fairly long duration with often quite vulnerable forms of intense collaboration, we've also been assembling from time to time through different forms of exchange. So not just the kind of intensely theoretical and discursive exchange that we've seen in the first session, but also exchanges through doings, through practices, particularly through curatorial practices and through assemblies of exhibitions and events, but also through the convening of public pedagogic serial exchanges. And so a little bit our session today with Nora and myself is going to look at these lenses of curatorial practice and also pedagogy a bit more. And for this contribution, we set ourselves this rather impossible question: what is the temporality, or what are the temporalities of spectral infrastructures? And so I guess perhaps what I would say as a sort of beginning thought in relationship to the frameworks that we had previously in the infrastructure project is that this question is an attempt to shift the terms somewhat into a temporal framework. So previously we'd been thinking about infrastructure not as a neutral facilitating material or technological base or foundation for activity, but rather infrastructure as a meshwork of social action and material technical agencies, i.e. as mutable and relational. So in that work, you can see there's a kind of ungrounding of grounds in this critical reconception. But we want to turn now to the kind of temporal definition of this, so to move from the spatial. Within that work that we've been doing as a collective, my own work has been oriented, I would say, towards elemental dynamics of the project pursued through, I would say, ecological imperatives. In particular, I've been concerned with the relationalities of the elements of earth, air, and flesh as infrastructure. And these elemental relations, like the others that we've heard about, are often hidden, invisible, barely legible, sustaining structures. They're also bonding, i.e. communal, and opening, i.e. epistemic forces. In that sense, they operate as what our colleague and friend Irit has been calling ephemeral glue, or a phrase of hers that I very much like, which is an immaterial critical consciousness. What I've been calling, probably with less rhetorical success in our generally materialist and secular fields of thought, spirit. So this work, I think, is also the work we want to do today, very much in affinity with Mao's and Stefano's frameworks around the pursuit of, let's say, devalued, or as Denise would have it, improper labors. And in particular, I'm kind of interested in aesthetics of sustained care, the passage of ancestral know-hows, the inheritances of abandoned practices, the maintenance of things subject to historical or cultural erasure or systemic violence, and the persistence of minor social and aesthetic gestures. So in all of those phrases, you'll hear a kind of temporal mark, right? Which is they're lasting. And in particular, I've been interested in the transmission or passage or movement of these infrastructures in and through time. And I've been looking particularly at the kind of transgenerational dynamics in relationship to this. I should also say a couple of sort of background thoughts in relationship to how I think both Nora and I have been thinking about the temporalities of spectral infrastructures. One is that, and this really is a kind of observation about our situation, which Stefano also mentioned, of kind of sensory, cognitive overload and exhaustion, which is that we face in the current moment condition of perpetual and overwhelming emergency that surrounds us as both a consequence of late capitalism's acceleration, but also the human species as catastrophic states. And that overwhelming sense of emergency is also now disseminated by a kind of technological omnipresence that summatively works as what Irit calls the categorical imperative of the now. And this categorical imperative is something which is, in her sense, I think, foreclosing a certain kind of agency and foreclosing futurity. So put simply, I guess that's to say that if we must respond to everything, then we can do nothing. And in particular, in my terms, I'd say we feel we cannot necessarily attune to and attend to the deep latencies and emergences that really ferment futures. And I guess at stake in all of this is there is also a kind of effective politics of futurity. And in a sense, we're chasing that old distinction that was made, of course, by Jacques Derrida, between the future, which is, I guess, what we might think of as the expected and predicted future emerging from known dimensions of the present, and its consequential extension and result. And then what Derrida termed the to come, l'avenir, the unexpected and unpredicted futural event, or as Denise mentioned, the new. So, which is often quite causeless and shapeless in our present mind's eye. There is a politics of affective futurity here, which I see as a kind of matter of orientation or comportment or posture towards that unknown futurity and towards restoring, as it were, or its restoration against a certain kind of foreclosure. And that orientation has emotional and ideational constitutional qualities of relation and despair and hope, of acceptance and defiance. And for me, I think the attempt is to identify practices that might steer a path away from cynicism and quietism without falling into the traps of a kind of empty optimism. So I don't know what we would call this kind of hope. It's obviously a difficult hope. If it is a hope, it's a hope without a kind of final telos or a regulative idea. So just to pull some of these thoughts and ideas through some, in particular, some curatorial practices and dramaturgical practices that I've been engaged with recently, which might disclose a little bit more pragmatically some of their logics without trying to close them down or name them. I've been pursuing for a while within and without the Free Thought Collective what I think of as this kind of symbiotic practice of thinking and making with the work of a number of different artists and thinkers. And particularly, I've been doing this through filmic essays. And I made a piece that was called Spirit Labor that moved beside the collaborative practices of the artists Janine Antoni, Anna Halprin, and Hélène Sixou. So that is between a sculptor who's in her 50s, a choreographer and social activist who's in her, well now is now 100, but was in her 90s when I was working with her, and a poet in her 70s. And so this is a kind of transgenerational, or I thought of this as a kind of transgenerational infrastructure of what I called spirited affinity, oriented towards eco-feminist principles of making with the eventhood of the fleshy materialities of environments. I'll try and show some of this work as I talk about it so that it can concretize a little further. So I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully you can see this. So much of the work that I was doing in this nexus of relations was taking place in this space. This is the Halprin dance deck in Marin County on by the side of Mount Tamalpais. It's north of San Francisco. The shot, of course, is in the, I'm guessing that's the late 1950s. And this is Lawrence Halprin and Anna Halprin. Lawrence Halprin was Anna Halprin's husband and was a landscape architect. And this space, this dance deck, was created in a sense to stop the fissure that would have happened for them as a couple, as Anna was a young mother at the time, to stop the fissure, as it were, between mothering and laboring. So she was able to move fluidly between her family home, which is beside the deck, and also the deck itself. And you can see also, I'll give you some shots of this as it looks recently. This is an environmental theatre that demolishes the walls of the theatre, that demolishes the cleave of the proscenium arch and admits the kinetic and the sonorous and the elemental circulations of the woods into the event of the performances that are made there. So it's a kind of symbiotic space, right? But for me, the architecture is not the infrastructure as such, or the infrastructure as an object, but it is in fact the enfleshed relations with bodies in time that are enmeshed within this space. So the work that I was doing with Anthony and with Halpern was, it started in effect from a gift that Halpern gave Anthony that was a prompt or an open score fragment from an earlier theatre work that was made in the 1960s. And this became the piece Paper Dance, which Anthony and Halpern made together with my involvement. And that work was done over a number of years. And it's also work that was then transforming that original fragment and relocating it in the process from a theatre back to, as it were, the dance deck, and then to a gallery. So the performance that Anthony made is a series of gestural and sculptural assemblages of body paper forms. It's a doubling of skins, figurations of the feminine and the maternal. And I came to think of it as a kind of remembering of air. It's also a carriage of that earlier work, of course, into the present. So it's a ghosting, it's a spectral act. As Prospero would say, all the players now are spectres, but it's a radically altered, a carriage into a radically altered sensibility and a radically altered condition. So how do we think the temporality of this kind of spectral infrastructure? What kind of carriage is this? If this is an inheritance, Anthony is making herself the critical heir, not of the actualized work, but of its unknown drives, its latencies and potentials. So this is maybe one kind of way to restore and honor that futural event by striking a relation, as it were, to what we might think of as the unhappened of the historical happening. And talk very briefly for the last 3 or 4 minutes now about another curatorial work that I've been engaged with and thinking through. This is, with Nora, we've talked about the tension of spectral infrastructures, and Nora will address this, I think, particularly in relationship to pedagogy, but the tension between the moment of rupture of the event and also the imperatives of endurance and sustaining the necessities of slow cumulative labors of enduring. Some of the curatorial work that I've been doing has been very much trying to transmit, as it were, the orientations for that latter kind of enduring. This is the artist Derching Shea, with whom I've been working, I guess, for over 18 years now. And Shea, in case some of you don't know his work, Shea basically made a series of 1-year-long performances in the late 1970s and early 80s. And in those 1-year-long performances, he established, let's call them a set of protocols or parameters for his existence in the time of the performance. These were very strict protocols that placed his life and his body under certain forms of sustained constraint and duress. And here you see him in the 1-year performance 1981 to 1982, which is commonly known as the outdoor piece. And this is a piece that I worked on curating with Shea for the Venice Biennale in 2017. And I'll show you a few images from that curation. In particular, I think what I was concerned with curatorially, and this is, I guess, how it pertains to the question of the temporality of spectral infrastructure, were the elemental and fleshed environmental relations that Shea struck in this work as a kind of counter-infrastructure, and how the work models that counter-infrastructure really outside of all of the existing, at that moment in time, the existing structures of support for art making. So what Shea's protocol in this context is that he will go outside for an entire year and he will take no shelter of any kind, right? So this is perhaps in a sense a more severe, although temporary, condition than homelessness, in the sense that it's a kind of outside of the outside. There's a really extreme elemental exposure that goes on here. And it also brings him into a very complex relationship with law and with lawlessness. And what's important, and something that I tried really strongly to emphasize in the curation, is that Shea, at this point in time, was an undocumented laborer. So, in fact, he was an undocumented laborer for all of his one-year performances. And he knew that as a non-white, unconnected immigrant subject, whose status was deemed illegal, right? That no one would actually believe that he had, in fact, conducted these semi-visible, semi-legible acts of endurance. In fact, that they were that they were true, that they had taken place. And so, of course, what he then uses is these elaborate systems of documentation. You see the photographs of the year, but also his daily maps of his passage around the island of Manhattan, even saving every possession that he had for the year. And he uses in all of these works, but in this work particularly, let's say, the language of the law, systems of documentation, of evidence, of legal verification, to secure his art's afterlife, right? To secure its continued communication. So key to this question of the work as what we might think of as a kind of rhythmics of endurance is the fact that Shea's one-year performances are all means of withdrawal from the social body in order to speak back to it about its conditions and its values. And so honoring this withdrawal and the integrities of its negations becomes the key care of the curatorial work. So it's not the work here, and this perhaps again relates to the sort of temporal framework of the spectral infrastructure for me. It's not about a straightforward recovery into historical record of an absented figure or an absented body of work that has largely been absented through structural racism in art history. But it's about a careful assembly of a set of resonances and relations and voices who create the conditions for a new history to emerge. One that is attendant not just to performance's eventhood, to its ruptures, but to its modalities of enduring in time. Okay, thank you so much. And I'll hand over now to Nora for her presentation.
So yes, Adrian, thanks so much for handing over to me. And I have to say that this question of the time, or of how we can act in these logics of time, has emerged between us in the last years a lot. Very often also in moments of exhaustion, resentment, desperation. And this brought us to this question in somehow. I mean, Adrian, with his very strong perspective of endurance that we have seen, has not only one time kind of helped me to endure with a horizon that is longer as only one's life. And these kind of horizons are rare in the moment. So this is how we came to this question, our question: what is the time of spectral infrastructure? The time of capitalism is always already measured and counted. And as we know and experience every day, it is never enough. But the infrastructure of time, of algorithmic and speculative neoliberalism is even worse. The future is already counted in, measured, organized. We sold promises in order to survive. We had to borrow from the future. All we could look forward to seems already pre-seen, suggested, sold. The conditions of overwhelming emergency, as Adrian puts it, exhaust us. The categorical imperative of the now forecloses agency and futurity, says Irit. The clock is ticking, the time is running. But in somehow we know there is always another time, a time that is older and slower, newer and quicker, a time of almost forgotten possibilities, a history of struggles, a time of conviviality, a stolen time that is born from anger and joy, fear and passion, a time that haunts the calendars, that insists and persists even if it should actually not exist, even if it is excluded and criminalized, even if it is invited and capitalized, that insists and persists, although it is squeezed out, although it is counted in and opted out at the same time. There's always already an angry, wayward and hopeful dream of another life in another time. Another time is possible. There is a history of other times that we can relate to, and people come together, and by being together and learning together and from each other about this other time, they actualize it. And this actually seems to be the only promise in a world in which speculation of the future allows no real future. So what is the time of spectral infrastructure? How can we endure under the radar of the event? And how can we describe it without delivering it to speculation? Obviously, in order to relate to that time, in order to keep its strength out of speculation, it seems as we need to imagine a radical break. So we hope for a radical break. It does not look like one, and it does not function at the same time, and things might not be as dialectic as we have heard already today. But how to and how not to imagine this radical break, and what does it mean? And in order to understand that we might not be there at all, I want to go back to an imagination of revolution from another time. Walter Benjamin, in the famous depiction, poignantly describes the moment of irreversibility of the revolution in which the clock stands still after being shot at during the July Revolution of 1830 in France. In the 15th section of the thesis on history, he writes, the consciousness of exploding the continuum of history is peculiar to the revolutionary classes in the moment of their action. The Great Revolution introduced a new calendar. The day on which the calendar started functioned as a historical time-lapse camera. And it is fundamentally the same day which, in the shape of holidays and memorials, always returns. The calendar does not therefore count time like clocks. There are monuments of a historical awareness of which there has not seemed to be the slightest trace for 100 years, yet in the July Revolution, an incident took place which did justice to this consciousness. During the evening of the first skirmishes, it turned out that the clock towers were shot at independently and simultaneously in several places in Paris. So in somehow, a completely different time is part of this time, or there is what does it mean? What is this completely different time? Something seems to make sense in this relation to the grand moments, moments after which all seems to be different. Let's think, for example, at the moment of occupation of a university. It's certainly something different to learn and teach on occupations and to learn and teach in an occupation. It was, for example, actually a completely different type of learning and teaching when in 2009 in Vienna, my seminar, which dealt with critical practices of learning and exhibiting, took place as squatting teaching in the occupied auditorium of the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna from 20 October 2009 until the end of the semester. The moment of occupation changed everything. So a completely other time within this time in somehow. We discussed in the name of education and in the space of a different reality to the neoliberal economization of education. And nevertheless, none of the discussions that had come before lost any of their meaning. Who knows? Perhaps they even had something to do with the fact that it had come to the occupation. So there is a momentary dimension and a processual dimension of this other time. But one of the problems with the grand moments of today is that they don't last very long. So in somehow the eventfulness kind of pushes us in one great moment after the other, in which we might believe that the clock stands still, but it does not at all. So on the one hand, we have to keep open for these moments, but also to understand that they might be only simulacrum moments, a phenomenon of the categorical imperative of the now. This makes them exhausting and unfortunately as quick and strong as they seem, as quick, they can be reversed. In this sense, in order to understand this time of spectral infrastructure, I propose to enter a simultaneity of both sides of the other times, the moment and the process, fugitivity and endurance, a para-chronological approach. And I say this because I believe that learning has the potential of imagining another possible future. This is actually what radical education is all about. So I just leave this as an example on the level of the image, and I go on with this question of the potential of imagining another possible future. If alongside Antonio Gramsci, we understand hegemony as something that is only based in part on force, but much more on agreement, it soon becomes clear that power needs to materialize in people's minds in learning processes, except it can also be questioned there. In this sense, Gramsci writes, every relationship of hegemony is necessarily an educational relationship. On the one hand, learning takes place in relationships and power structures. On the other hand, it is also a preparation, as everything that we learn is full of the sediment of history, but is still learned in the present and, above all, refers to a future in which what has been learned comes into play, possibly and often in a completely different way than expected. Children learn the language that is full of relationships of subordination, but they also learn words by doing that they will teach to their children, and who knows in which world they will be spoken. So there's, with every word, there's the sediment of history, but also the future of a completely different context in which this word would make something we cannot even imagine. As learning has this double potential of adaptation and revolution, and because it also links together what was, is, and could be, it is a practice full of binding and transformative potential. Hegemony therefore presents itself as a process that constantly needs to stabilize itself and is therefore always in danger of becoming destabilized. In this context, destabilization also appears as a process. And this destabilization as the imagination of another possible world and describing, defining, and living it already now, and this is the para-chronological dimension, can happen when we learn together. And here another kind of prefiguration than the one of speculative capitalism and artificial intelligence appears. If we assume that learning can serve to challenge the existing hegemony, this happens in two ways. On the one hand, the existing truths and forms of knowledge often become fragile, debatable, and disputable. On the other hand, other forms of knowledge may come to light. These relate to the knowledge of struggles, but also the knowledge of another possibility. In their book, The Undercommons, Stefano Hani and Fred Moten quote C.L.R. James with the wonderful words. I am a black man, number one, because I am against what they have done and are still doing to us. And number two, I have something to say about the new society to be built, because I have a tremendous part in that which they have sought to discredit. There is therefore a knowledge of the undercommons that we can learn from each other. For this knowledge, Hani and Moten believe that there is always in institutions, in the street, at night, a context for what they call study, a practice of coming together and learning together, spending time together, and with what we know because we have a tremendous part in that which they have sought to discredit. Spending time together with the topics without established objectives and schedules, and above all, without credit points, they say. It is a type of learning in the interstices of institutions, in the interstices of economization. In this way, we learn another possible world from each other, and that can't be done alone, but only as a collective process, as learning from each other. As such a process, the anticipation of the other world seeks to achieve hegemony in the positional world, but sometimes it is first and foremost about surviving the winter of another possible future. And this actually is what Adrian brought in. Fugitivity for Hani and Moten is quicker than critique that captures it. It is always already gone. And if it is gone, this is my question, how is it enduring? It endures in a ghostly way. While it is hiding, silenced, threatened, unseen, it is always already gone and always already there without demanding to be part. And now, how can we relate to it then? And for me, this is the question of spectral infrastructure. How can we relate to it then? To these histories of endurance and fugitivity, to these histories of the tremendous part that are as much hidden as they are there. How can we relate to these histories of possible futures without historicizing them? How can we relate to them without misunderstanding their call as a demand to be part? I propose a relationship of spectral infrastructure that is faithful to the momentariness as much as to the process, to the historicity and contextuality as much as to the potential of actualization of the conflicts here and now. The time of spectral infrastructure might therefore relate to the asynchronicity between process and moment, between the time of fugitivity, as Hani and Moten describe it, and the time of endurance, as Adrian talked about. And all this takes place under and in between what is allowed, described, and historicized. And here, the unarchivable comes into play. The unarchivable that we will work on more in the next years, I hope. The unarchivable that is part of the archive, that is in somehow the commons of the archive. Because if you look closely enough, you can get infected by the unarchivable. If you go to the archive, you will find you will find these moments as actualization. You can get infected by the unarchivable, then the unarchivable is actualized. And I believe that care in and for the archive is not merely for the material. It is care for the potential actualizations of the unarchivable. And here comes the question that comes with that. So if archives and museums are places of sleeping conflicts, how to kiss the struggle awake? And I will leave us with this question.
Thank you so very much, Nora. Thank you so very much, Adrienne. Wonderful, lots of food for thought and questions, with which I would like to encourage everybody to use the chat function if you have questions yourselves. I would like to bring them into conversation so that we try to connect through a conversation rather than a Q&A between me and Adrienne and Nora. I do have one question that I have received to kick off with, and that is, if one speaks of spectral infrastructure, if one speaks of the time of spectral infrastructure, can one also speak of time as spectral infrastructure? So I don't know whether you would like to start from here. Can one see time as spectral infrastructure, actually?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that, and I'll try and think about it concretely through one of the examples of work that I've been talking about. In particular, there is a piece by Deching Shea that is often called the time clock piece. It's the piece that precedes the performance I showed you, which was the outdoor piece. And in the time clock piece, Shea's protocol for the year is to clock onto a worker's time clock on the hour, every hour, for the entire year. And as he clocks onto the worker's time clock on the hour, every hour for the entire year, he takes a single still of him standing, as it were, to attention, being called, as it were, to the image, but also to the time of labor. And what happens is that this still that is taken over the year then turns into effectively a 6-minute film that condenses time, the time of the year, into 6 minutes. And so we see in watching the film, we experience this kind of strange vibratorial time that is both too fast, hyper accelerated, and at the same time too slow. Shea's hair is growing, his body is visibly changing. It's a kind of weird, uncanny temporality that we can't really locate anywhere. And in a sense, this is the kind of gift of the work that is, I think, time as an infrastructure in itself. But it's not a time that we, I think, can know or easily contain or recognize. And of course, formally and aesthetically, it's a weird kind of hybrid time, because it's it comes from the in-between space of different technologies, the still of the photogram and the duration of film, right? And it's a kind of interface between those two temporalities, and of course the lived duration, the lost time, as it were, of Shea's year, the time he gave with his body to the work. So I think of that, it's interesting to me how that work as well has become a kind of transgenerational infrastructure in itself. So other artists have taken up the kind of the call inherent in that work, and start to make a kind of fabric of relations and dialogic discourses on time as a spectral infrastructure through the relationalities of those works. So yeah, for me, time is the spectral infrastructure.
Nora, would you like to carry on with this?
I'm not sure. Let's wait for the next question, and maybe then I can come back to what I thought about it.
Great. Can I then, Adrian, can I get back to the notion of resonance and rhythm and trembling? In our conversations, you very often refer to Edouard Glissant's thought on this. To paraphrase it, to understand the world, one needs to tremble with it. Now, I want to connect this to yesterday's conversations around the notion of collectivity. So what holds us together, what brings us together? And it has become obvious it's not a consensus, it's not an agreement, it's not some shared experience. And your proposition here is indeed rhythm, movement, tremble. And I just wonder whether you could elaborate on that. How do we get together, if you will, on this basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's been preoccupying me, not only in the kind of the dialogues of free thought over the years, which, you know, as I've mentioned previously, we've talked about as Stefano calls it our thrown togetherness, our loose collectivity, our sloppy ensembleness. But it's also something that's preoccupying me in relationship to really the kind of life of collectives. And particularly, I'm sort of working at the moment on a long-standing experimental theatre collective, and trying to sometimes interrogate with them what it is that holds us together, holds them together, but also actually holds us together in the sense that has retained my long-standing critical and intellectual investment in their labors and wanting to dialogue with those labors. And it is precisely, I think, that quality of trembling which perhaps kind of conjures it for me most readily, in the sense that, yeah, as you said, it's not the consensus that is the binding matter, let's say. But to me, it seems to, though, of course, the consensus on all kinds of levels in time is absolutely necessary for the sustenance of the collective, or a certain kind of, let's say, form of collective recognition, of which each individual's recognition is quite different, of the pursuit. But rather the thing, the binding substance, the ephemeral glue, as Irit would have it, is in a way the pursuit of the thing between us. And it has that thingly quality, in the sense that it never stabilizes into an object, but it becomes the source and the directionality of the aesthetic and the creative and critical pursuit. And so that thing is the thing that's trembling between us, right? It's the thing that we have agreed and understood, each differently, is of value, but nonetheless a kind of amorphous and elusive value, and is, in a sense, a kind of nexus of collective desire. And so how do we hold, like the question is, how do we hold it? Not even how do we hold it, because I think to hold it seems to be to grasp it, right? And if we grasp at it, we've killed it. We all know that from collective practices, right? So more the thing is, how do we carry it with open hands between us, and how do we carry it on in time to others? And this, I think, is the question that, of course, Nora is pursuing tremendously, also in relationship to a kind of a situation of pedagogic practice.
There's indeed a question on pedagogy, and I would like to go into the direction, but I have one quick question still, Adrian. You mentioned spirited affinities. And also in what you just described, you perhaps misspoke or mentioned that consciously when you talk what holds them together versus what holds us together. And I wanted to return to that because that made me think about elective affinities. You know, the not just get but you know, the chemical processes of elective affinities. Certain things come together, other things just don't. Is that how you think of spirited affinities, or do I get it completely wrong?
Well, it's great. It's a really fantastic question. I think of it in part. I mean, I think I'm pursuing a certain kind of idea of materialist spirit, in the sense of the surrealist poet Paul Eluard's realization that there is another world, and it's in this world, right? It's not, for me, spirit is not the carriage of a kind of transcendent force or being outside of being, but something immanent within the material world as a kind of immaterial quality. And it's not so I guess also when I say spirited affinity, I'm trying to indicate also the affective stakes, the passions, the open passions at play, outside of a particular kind of idea of religious beliefs, let's say, for instance. So, you know, all of the artists that I've been working with have very different understandings of religion and of spirituality. And so there are kind of crossings in these collaborations of very different understandings of spirit. But there is a certain kind of spiritedness in all of them as well, even if I think they would perhaps refuse that term. And of course, the spiritedness refers to a certain energetics as well, to come back to Mao's invocation of the movements of energy, right? That's what labor is. There is a certain kind of in all of the artists that I've been working with, a certain kind of totalizing passion, a consuming passion for this interface of art and life, which enables forms of articulation, political, ethical articulation, that are perhaps not so present in other kinds of work. So that is sort of the spiritedness. That's, for me, it's all part of the spiritedness.
Great, thank you. Nora, shall we take a question from Julia? Julia Morandera, who asks, what types of counter-pedagogies attuned to non-hegemonical experiences of time do you imagine?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that we all know this moment, this parachronological moment of learning together. It's something that might happen when we sit in the classroom, when we start to read, and even now it can happen, you know, it happened to me. It's this something we start to relate to a certain trembling. We relate to it through what we read, what we share with each other, what we know, but also from what we relate to history and what we try to imagine, but not, I cannot imagine it like this, but we do it together in small steps while we are there. And this, I really think that we can describe it in somehow is not in any other way than parachronological. It does not follow the classical time of the clock. It follows something else, and in this sense, there is a huge strength also of this other world already now that also Adrian was speaking about. And I think this is what I refer to. So I would say that if Vera was talking about naming the world, I mean, of course, we can name the world differently in such a situation. And by naming it differently, we also already make it a bit different, possibly. And if we cannot make it really different, the potential different world is still there, we build it. And this is also a potential of trembling.
I heard you saying, opposing a question a couple of times, how do we come together to learn what does not yet exist? Could you elaborate on that? How do we learn what doesn't yet exist?
Yeah, I mean, we heard today that, I mean, the word liberty is so terrible that we cannot even use it anymore. You know, the same we could even say about equality and even solidarity. You know, we sit here and we talk about how to hold things together, but all this seems to be so misused in somehow in these liberal democracies we live in, that it does not even seem to make sense. But can we sit together and imagine liberation? Can we sit together and imagine equality differently? So I think this is what I speak about, and also what I understand in somehow as a radical democratic education, to as Oliver Machat would say, liberation, yeah, from all these violent histories, and equalize equality in somehow. So what I mean is that that it totally that I think with Gramsci that it totally makes sense to imagine another possible world, and by imagining it, we work on making it happen. I think this is what I relate, what I want to say with that.
Thank you. Let's say, okay, there is a thank you. Before we turn to further questions, and I still want to encourage everybody to post questions, place them in a chat.
Yeah, can I just say, can I just quickly say something?
Sure.
And actually want to say to you, Maria, because I know that this is something you also think a lot about. And of course, it's difficult to address it. But while working on it, I have to say, I don't think that this is only a good thing, what I'm talking about. I think that this coming together under the radar is also something that happens even if fascists are silenced, even if they are forbidden, even if they in somehow should not exist. There is a kind of possibility to relate to this trembling, that is not only a good thing. So I think it's much more than only a wish, which also makes it in somehow strong.
Yeah, I think this is a reason. I mean, at BAC we have dedicated quite some time to thinking about this matter specifically within the context of propositions for non-fascist living. First question is, are we held together or are we actually kept apart, right? And so we cannot assume that there is something that holds us together. I think, in my opinion, I think it's a hard labor to figure out ways of being together in these circumstances. But indeed, when you talk about the spectral and ghostly and written, it brings people together around various ideals of the future world. And this is really difficult to parse, actually, in a situation where you want to overcome the dichotomy of us versus them, because this is how we are already kept apart. So what are the ways of modeling that could help us circumnavigate around this? And for me, the notion of anticipatory learning, or maybe what you think about when you talk about how do we come together to learn what does not yet exist, is essentially a labor of imagining the world differently otherwise, but also enacting that other alternative imaginary, right? So I think these are quite important things to think about, and that connects me to the question you left us with, the last question, your last slide. And I would desperately want us to try to, in some way, address it. You know, is there a way we can start answering this? And there was a question about archives and museums when you refer to the unarchivable, maybe unmuseolable. What's the proper word about proper word to use here? I wouldn't quite know. You talk about unarchivable as the undercommons of the archive. Is there something as the undercommons of the museum we could activate to what you probably pointed at when you talk about, when you ask, can we, you know, kiss it awake in some way? So I wonder whether you would like to, you would like to take a stab and answer your own question, while I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I would not call it unmuseable, because the museum is also the place of awakening of these conflicts. It's not only the place of petrification. And in this sense, and why do I say that? Because actually the history of the museum, the modern museum, let's say, comes out of a revolution. So the fact that the things in the museum, that we talk about them as things that have been decontextualized and recontextualized, has, in my reading, to do with the fact that they have been taken away from the nobles and the church and have been reappropriated by the people. And this is what made them things in the museum, the Louvre. And this is actually a recommunalization. Now, we know that this recommunalization at the same time is the history of terrible violence and stealing and so on. So we have a double logic in this. So already two conflicts, and they kind of really move in the things there. And this is in somehow so the process of the museum is is this, and now how to relate to that. I mean, it's calling us to relate in somehow.
Mm-hmm. Irit tells us unexposable, Ariola suggested unrepresentative. Thank you so very much. This is where my Englishies failed entirely. Important question, I think. Thank you, Rachel. What is the difference between trembling and ideology?
It's a tricky question, but maybe just to inflect it back through the discussion that you've just been having about museology. It really reminded me of the place that we got to at the end of the last collective conversation before this one with Stefano, which was, of course, the thing we're all in pursuit of, this kind of intensification of a kind of limit realization. When Stefano says, so how do we, the question is how to keep what's not given, right? Is my question also in relationship to Shay curatorially, right? How I perhaps wouldn't use the word keeping, because I'm thinking particularly in the discursive terrain of the visual arts and of museums, that keeping has an ideological definition, and it's quite hard to wrestle keeping out from the logics of property, as we see with repatriation of objects, for instance, right? So what we need is a different understanding of keeping. I think for me, my word is carriage, right? That one is not keeping anything, but rather one is carrying something for others. And so my question is, you know, how is it that the museum becomes a kind of a space of carriage, not of objects actually, but of the things nonetheless carried within objects, right? That are perhaps unknown to the ideologies of the institution.
And that's, yeah. No, please finish. I want to try to answer this question, because I think actually, but I'm not sure, but it might be actually the other side, the completely different side of it. So in the sense of the classical example of Althusser, no, of ideology. So the policeman is calling me and I look at the policeman. And in this moment, when he calls me, I become this kind of police subject. But you know what happens in this moment? For example, I'm super afraid, so I start to create a weird sadistic game of desire. Because he calls me, I look back, I don't know why, but I hope that he looks at me, and then I hate myself because of that. And I actually don't want to be subjectified but I am. So I'm pretty angry and I'm looking for someone else, and someone else and me, we have this kind of gaze because we know that, okay, there might be a solidarity with and against and so on. And all this is the potential for the trembling. Is all this what happens at the same time when I am called. So now I'm completely called and completely trapped, but all this desire and potential violence and potential solidarities are there at the same time. And there can be another call. There can be this moment when this kind of breaks out.
Jean-Mathé raised a hand. I wonder whether you would want to unmute yourself and pose the question yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I couldn't help, as I heard Nora and Adrian speak, I couldn't help but think of what's gone on in the last year at Columbia with Bernard E. Harcourt, and what happened at PS1, and then what happened at Santa Cruz with Gina Dent and Angela Davis, and the extraordinary time of barring time, or those who are doing time, and even those on death row, who they struggle to save as Trump tried to get his constituencies together, this extraordinary time of coalition between those fighting for the lives of those doing time, many of whom were incarcerated as teenagers and have spent their lives in solitary confinement. So there's something, I mean, one of the exhibitions linked with these sites that I've mentioned was called Borrowing Time. So just the doing of time and the extraordinary coalition between those that fight for abolition and show the relationship, the spectral infrastructures between the carceral logics, between slavery, between border regimes, between neoliberal capital or financial capital, and the kind of work that needs to be done to produce a coalition to fight for those who just haven't got a voice, who is somehow working with this spectrality to remain alive in solitary, sometimes up to 40 years, who are then released and come out and form part of that coalition and have spoken on Zoom as part of these extraordinary events over the last year. And I think that one can't think time and spectrality infrastructure without thinking abolition. I think it's so profoundly linked when you think of people who are doing time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I don't know whether Nora or Adrian, you want to respond quickly? Thank you. There are also comments in the chat that I will not be able to read, and I fear we are also running out of time. I'm going to quickly scan whether Eleanor Roberts, thanks for this talk going off the economist paradigms mentioned today in the work of prefiguring and political imagination. How can we rethink affinities and responsibilities to the political housework? The labors that are often wrongly but understandably considered voided of imagination, the organizing, the admin, the affective labor, the groundwork, the cultivation, the tilting, etc. Adrian, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question from Eleanor, and it's actually super resonant because in the last conversation we were having around these spectral infrastructures in which we were talking around Shay, one of our partners that back facilitated actually forwarded to me a perfect example of a spectral infrastructure that was entirely related to Shay's discourse on, let's say, on unrecognized labor, which was a collective of feminist artists working precisely with domestics, with the labors of the everyday, mimicking the sort of temporal structures of Shay's work, but disseminating them across a collective body. So, and bringing into a particular kind of consistency that which is perpetually hidden from categories of proper labor. So it's so exciting for me also to think that might be the directionality of a spectral infrastructure, right? That it can do this this form of beautiful swerving and receptivity to our understandings of particular contemporary political formations that were in fact suppressed in the original work.
Thanks, Adrian. In closing, I would like to at least read out a question from Witske Maas from Bach, actually. So this is, I mentioned we have an exhibition waiting for opening as a public institution. We're still closed due to pandemic conditions. It's an exhibition and project called Fragments of Repair, by and with Kader Attia. It's a project that's conceptualized as an archive of knowledges on decolonial repair, actually proposing decolonial repair as a way to engage with the planetary urgencies of collective mental health in a world wounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this notion of time has been articulated on a number of occasions, not to mention in a number of works by Kader Attia. When he talks about art as a means to slow time, thinking of art as a means of decompressing time, which has been relentlessly compressed through automation, technocratically governed lives. Yet Adrian and Nora gave examples of various hybrid temporalities. How does spectral infrastructure allow different temporal experiences of the world in ways that disrupt the colonial trappings of time, but also in ways that holds us together in shared, albeit heterogeneous temporality? Or do our variegated temporalities ultimately hold us apart? And I'm reading this out, not as a question, as something that we leave there hanging. And hopefully we can take this up in one of our next sessions, maybe immediate session or throughout the research we will engage in together. Thank you so very much, everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined us for this session and who joined us in conversation. I found it extraordinary, energizing, and inspiring. And I look forward to meet all of you again in just about, if I'm not mistaken, 12 minutes when we gather for the last session with Irid Rogov and Luis Moreno. Thank you so very much, everybody.